There was a time when I used to wear reading glasses, and then I got some glasses that would help me read the signs when I was driving. And then I found I was having problems in between, and I was getting mixed up 3 different kinds of glasses, and I was leaving them in places. And so I went and, got those progressive kind of lenses, which took a while to get used to, but I'm very glad I did. Everything just smoothly transitions, and I can look down and read. I can look out and see you. And if I'm driving, even at night in the rain, I can see the signs. Miracle. What a way. It was like a tremendous relief for me. I didn't realize how anxious I was becoming and how sometimes I just felt lost. So, having told you all that, that means I lost my place and I have to go back to where I went. Oh yeah. But I noticed that I was starting to have trouble with the fine print. And I knew what that meant. That meant that I have to go and get a whole new set of glasses just to improve one aspect. And they're expensive, and overall it works pretty good, and I can use a magnifying glass on some things. So I decided I'd just live with it and save a few bucks. One day I drove over to Fuller Village to get my hair cut. Susan is the hairdresser over there, and I like going to her, and she knows how to deal with my Swedish head. And so as I started driving home, I noticed to my great consternation that while I could read the dashboard quite clearly, I was having a hard time making out the street signs. And I said, my self-talk got to be a little nasty. You dummy, you should have gone in and gotten tested after all, but you're just too stubborn and you're too cheap. I could see the road, but I didn't really feel secure, so I slowed down. I felt like I'd aged 30 years overnight. I was leaning over and driving maybe 30, and people were behind me and beeping at me and stuff. And so I got home, I breathed a sigh of relief, I was safe. I told Ann about it. And I was just about ready to call and make an emergency appointment to get my eyes checked and get new glasses when we decided to examine the glasses, and she noticed that there was some pink in the frame. And then it hit me. When I got my hair cut, Susan took my glasses off, put them down on the counter. When it was time to go, she gave me her glasses instead. I called her up. I told her what happened. I asked if I could come right back and make the switch. She said, well, maybe, but I like your glasses better than mine. But she was willing to part with them. This wasn't a matter of rose-colored glasses, was it? No, it was a matter of just a little curvature in the glass that helped me to see clearly or made my world fuzzy. And I'm not talking about optometrist stuff today. I'm talking about seeing more through the eyes of God. Because as we look at the world around us, just with our own sense of self and projections, it looks much differently than if we see it as God might see it, if we see others as God might see them, as God might see you. How important it is to really be able to see, not only to drive the car, but to relate, to be a citizen of this world, to be a follower of Jesus. If only our other problems of perspective could be solved so easily as were mine, by just switching the glasses. During his brief administration, President John F. Kennedy believed that the United States needed to change its approach to the ever-present tensions in the Middle East. President Eisenhower's administration had been judged to be taking rather a tough posture with the Arabs and the Israelis, while at the same time maintaining an overall position of support and financial aid. It was always a delicate balance. Every nation involved knew that this was a very delicate dance from which none of them could really walk away. Egypt, under President Nasser, was making things difficult, putting pressure on the U.S., making explosive or volatile kinds of remarks to the world audience, and at the same time kind of flirting with the Soviet bloc. He wanted more aid from the U.S., and he knew that if he gave the impression that the Arab world might go over to the Soviets, that would be a big problem, diplomatically, etc., for us. We couldn't afford to have the Arabs ally themselves with the Soviets. But the U.S. also had a long-standing relationship with Israel, and we know what the state of affairs was between the Arabs and Israel. This not only involves strategic position in the flow of trade in that area, but also that magical word, oil. A war broke out in Yemen at that time, and this eventually pitted Egypt against the Saudis, both Arab nations, but they had their own agenda, their own oar in on this conflict. But they were working behind the scenes. Kennedy tried to stay connected to both sides. He pressured the Saudis to back off of Yemen in an attempt to pacify Egypt, and at the same time flew U.S. jets over Saudi airspace to remind the world that the administration was going to protect the Saudis and not allow anything to happen there. And of course, Kennedy's attempts pleased neither side and seemed to make relations worse. This is much more complex than I can convey here, but the key that caught my attention was the Egyptians and the Saudis didn't so much see what the U.S. was doing or offering to them as much as what they were doing for their enemy, and that really irritated them. Same situation, three different players, three very different perspectives on what the meaning of these actions or proposed actions were. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? Well, any child can tell you it's both. It's both. It does matter, though, how you focus on it. It matters what kind of an attitude you have. It matters how open you are to, but it really matters how clearly do you see bigger truth. Not just what we see, but what we miss. Seeing with the eyes of God means we don't miss as much. We see things that we find uncomfortable. The backlog of ancient enmities in the Middle East makes it almost impossible to reach meaningful agreements. We've seen that for decades. Sort of an underlying thing, if you love me, I want you to hate my enemy. Eisenhower tried to be tough, Kennedy tried to be nice, and both failed in their objectives. You can try to change someone's perspective, but people tend to see what they want. I know that's true for me. And sometimes I'll get a revelation, I'll say, I never knew that. That helps explain this and that. If you want to go with God, though, we can count on the fact that God's going to get our glasses finely tuned and have them cleaned and bring everything into sharp focus. Everything. And that, of course, makes for problems. Like the older woman who had had a long overdue double cataract surgery just weeks apart, and then looked in the mirror, was horrified at how wrinkled she'd become in the last 20 years. You know, yes, Lord, I want to see, sort of. Today's passage about Jesus healing the blind man is fascinating. He's the only person we know of who needed a second treatment from Jesus in order to be healed. And there's been all kinds of debate and dialogue and scholarly input about that, and I'm not going to go there. But the man makes great progress with the first healing. From seeing nothing to be able to see people, but they look like trees. No real distinguishing features. He couldn't tell if they were trees or human beings. Then the next time, he's able to see clearly and tell that they're people, and not only that, he can tell the differences between them. He sees everything now. He sees them for what they really were. One of our Unbinding the Gospel prayer experiences invited us to go into some place like the mall and just sit there and just watch the people as they pass by. Now, people sometimes enjoy that, just sitting watching the crowd. But with a different focus. We were asked to pray for each person not asking them to sit down and listen while we pray, but to pray within ourselves, because each was a child of God. Each was precious. And the prayer was really more for ourselves, to understand that, to see that more clearly. And then to pay attention to what happened within us. Well, I chose to do it while taking the subway from Ashmont into Boston. A real mix of people. And I casually sat there and I looked at each one. The young woman with 3 children, each about a year apart, trying to keep them comfortable and safe on a moving train. I prayed a lot for her. The professional woman dressed for work in some place special. The student who was reading calmly as the train went bumpity, bumpity, bump. The 2 young guys showing off for the girls. And the down-and-out guy off by himself in a corner. As I continued to focus on each one and to pray for them as the precious child of God that they were, something interesting happened. I'd always noticed the people on the train. I'd seen them before, but it really, metaphorically, was like they were trees, just sort of faceless people moving around. No eye contact or conversation. It's not usually done, is it, to start a conversation with a stranger on the tee. It's sort of seen as, what's your game? What do you want? So I didn't really see them through God's eyes. I honored and respected them, but they weren't particularly precious to me because I didn't know them. But after praying in this way on that day, I discovered anew that they're precious to God, and that made all the difference. Just like I hope I'm precious to God. That was very humbling, and at the same time enlivening. Without them saying a word to me, or me to them, I felt a deep sense of connection. Really seeing someone for the first time has its benefits. Getting in touch with the sacred in them was the key to helping me see them as they really were, as they were created to be. In closing, remember the story of John Newton, the author of our beloved hymn, Amazing Grace. Many of you may know his story, but it's always worth repeating. You know, he was the captain of a slave ship making trips across the ocean. from Africa to the New World. He hated the work, but it was the best pay he could find as a captain. And then one day, he saw his cargo and himself as they really were, children of God. And he felt crushed with guilt for his support of this evil business. And so he wrote, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Some people said, that's an awful strong word, but I understand that the original word was worm. So it got a little less offensive. But that's how he felt, lowly, beneath contempt. "I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see." That's the kind of seeing I'm talking about. Seeing through the eyes of God. And it changed everything for him. And what amazed him most, the truth had always been there before him. He just had to open his heart and let it in. When he did, he broke. He wept. When he got up off his knees, he was really a new person. Because now he could really see. And he couldn't be a captain of a slave ship anymore. And he really thought that he was so despicable that God could never love him or forgive him. His sin was too deep and too dark, too unforgivable. But he found that God's love was greater than his sin, and that God could forgive even him. And that was amazing grace. He was amazed that he felt forgiven. Okay. So seeing through the lens of God doesn't just mean seeing others, but seeing ourselves. Seeing the ugliness, but also the love of God that never abandons us. And you know, he quit the slave trade and he went on to become an ordained Episcopal clergyman. Spent the rest of his days telling people about this amazing God and this God's amazing grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I really, really see. Amen.